and I'm going to record this program. And I would love to welcome Dr. David Greenhaw, who is an ordained minister of the United Church of Christ and President Emeritus of Eden Theological Seminary. Dr. Greenhaw has lectured and preached on 6 continents. He has a long history of service to the interfaith community, most recently completing an term as chair of the Cabinet of Interfaith Partnership of Greater St. Louis. Although his PhD is in philosophical theology, his areas of interest include homiletics, liturgics, contemporary culture, and American religious history. Please welcome Dr. David Greenhaw this morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Judith. It's great to see you all. Many of you I know, and some are still popping up. I just wanted to begin this morning by saying that I was invited to do this program by Harvey Schneider, who I see there. And Harvey Schneider is somebody I have huge respect for. It's hard to find anyone more committed to interfaith vitality than Harvey and Leanne. They're just amazing citizens in our community that way. And when Harvey knocks and asks me to respond, I say, sure, why not? For Harvey, I'd be happy to. So thank you, Harvey, for the invitation, and it's good to see you.
Thank you for your kind remarks, David.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk this morning about American Protestantism, but I want to talk not about American Protestantism as such, although I will do some of that, but about the splintering of American Protestantism. And I have a reason to do it, besides the fact that I'm interested in it and hope that you might be, but also because I believe it lies at the base in many ways of the splintering that we're experiencing in American culture today. The history of this splintered movement, and it's been splintered for some time, has an impact on where we are today. And if we are to find a path forward in our American life and culture, we may have to think back about how we got to where we are. So I want to give another disclaimer, though, as I begin. I used to say I'm not a historian, and that's true, but this is my house. I've read a lot, and so I actually think I know quite a bit more about history than I used to. But what I really want to say is that history is a very hard thing to get your hand around, because what we want is we want to see what happened when that caused this that happened today. We look for causality in history. We want to say, yep, when that happened, everything since has been this way. And of course, there are turning points, powerful points. And so you can talk correlation in history. This correlates to that, but causality with human beings is much harder to lay your hand on. So I'm going to paint some correlation pictures and do some images of where we are and how we got, and do an overview. And I hope to do this in 20-25 minutes at the most, so that you can join in and have a conversation with me, ask questions, disagree. Let's mix it up a little bit as we go. And then we'll stop at the usual time as well. So I want to start with a wonderful historian who's been very influential in my view of Protestantism, Sidney Mead, who is a professor at Yale in ecclesiastical history. Mead wrote a book called The Lively Experiment. And I'm just going to read one little 2 sentences out of it, if I can get my glasses on here. He says, Americans never had time to spare. What they did have during all their formative years was space. Americans have never had enough time. We're always in a hurry. We have to go fast. We have to do the next thing. We have to get things done. We have to move quickly. Why? I don't know exactly why. My son has moved from New Orleans to Rochester, Minnesota this year. And in his side yard in New Orleans, he had a garden. And he could plant anything any time of the year. There was an 11-month growing season. You couldn't help but grow a garden in New Orleans. And he's moved to Rochester, and the growing season's about that long. They had a threat of snow a week ago. And so if you live in an agricultural culture, you've got to plant while the planting's good and get your food in and out, and you don't have time to waste. Maybe that's part of the reason Mead says this about us, but we always are in a hurry, aren't we? And Mead observes that that's always been the case. But he also observes that even though we don't have time, we had lots of space. You came to America and it was massive. You could get here, and if you could figure out how to get across that river, move across that plain, get around that lake, climb over those mountains, if you could get where you needed to go, you could get somewhere else, there was lots and lots of space. Not so much now, things have changed, but in our formative years, as Mead says, we had lots of space. And what that meant for American Protestantism is that you didn't have to get along with anybody. That is, if you were next to somebody and you disagreed with them, if they were a type of congregationalist, that is, a group that was organized around the way their congregation, they were governed by their congregation. If you didn't like them because you thought baptism was for adults and not for children, then you'd move from Massachusetts to Rhode Island. Not a long distance, but enough to start your own institutions like Brown University, because you could always find another place. Or even worse, if you were like the Mormons, and everywhere you landed, somebody persecuted you and was distressed by your practices and your beliefs and would run you out of town, you could go to the next town. I don't think it's really true that anyone ever wanted to move to the Salt Lake City in Utah, but it was a place where nobody else wanted to move, so Mormons could live there and make an incredible life. Now, of course, because of skiing and all that, everybody wants to go to Utah, but not before air conditioning. People were able to move and to go to different places and to expand, and there wasn't a necessity to get along with your neighbor. You could just move on. This was Mead's point about the formative years. And this led already in the beginning to laid the groundwork, the roots for this splintering, this moving on, this developing distinct identities that didn't have to cooperate. All right, I'm going to bracket this idea for a minute. I'm going to come back and define some of the basics of Protestantism. A theologian named Paul Tillich described what he called the Protestant principle. Are you all able to hear me all right? I just realized I didn't even do a sentence. Okay. He described what he called the Protestant principle. And essentially what it means is that you're not bound to external sources or institutions for what you believe. You are freed from other groups telling you what you are to believe. You have you don't have to have a pope tell you what to believe. Of course, that's in the early formative years. But the notion about Protestantism is, as it cuts across all Protestantism, is the ability to, it's an enlightenment shaped thing, and the ability to think for yourself, to act independently, that really a triumph of the individual, because every individual can have access to God. Now, there are mediating institutions, and for Protestantism generally, that mediating institution is really sola scriptura, the Bible. It's not accidental that Protestantism emerged at the same time as the printing press. As the printing press made books available, you didn't have to rely on someone else to teach you. As long as you could read, you could determine belief on your own. You could raise your own critical thinking and look at that. And this idea that one could have access to the infinite through finite things, but always beyond, this idea became an animating notion for Protestantism. So I'm going to shift gears just real quickly and describe three types of American Protestantism. American Protestantism, really, I'm going to begin with a very distinctive type of Protestantism. There's been a wonderful recent documentary on the Black Church. African American communities and Protestantism is a very distinctive type of Protestantism, because it really was forced to be a segregated religious group, and it provided a distinctive role in the life of the community, and it evolved and developed into a powerful religious force in American life. It is not monolithic. It is quite diverse in itself, and it has parallels and alliances with the other two types of Protestantism I want to describe. But already in 1784, Richard Allen founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, because it was not possible to worship in the main sanctuary with white churches. And so he founded a movement, the AME Church. But like other Protestants, they splinter. There's AME, there's AME Zion, there's CME. There's a variety of different churches. In African American Protestantism, there's a Baptist churches, but I say churches because there's a National Baptist Church and the Progressive Baptist Church and the Missionary Baptist Alliance. There's churches galore that have distinctions, and so the Protestant practice of splintering is paralleled also in African American churches. I want to describe two other Protestant movements, though, in bigger categories. And the roots of these two Protestant categories really were formed during the Civil War, leading up to the Civil War, question of slavery and abolition, but more profoundly, Charles Darwin plays a tremendous role. Darwin wrote The Origin of the Species roughly the time of the Civil War, but its influence wasn't until the beginning of the 20th century. And Darwin's evolutionary theory called into question a reading of the Bible that said that the creation happened in 6 days, and with a little bit of math, you could make it 2,800 years ago. There's all kinds of numbers, certainly not millions and millions of years ago. And this fomented a division and a problem in the church that was represented, and the roots were elsewhere. It wasn't causal again as much as symbolically formative. But what happened, and Randall Balmer has written a wonderful book called Protestantism in America. He wrote it with Lauren Winter, just an excellent book. And Balmer describes did you all see Inherit the Wind? Have you ever seen that play about the Scopes monkey trial? You know, I loved that movie as a kid. Frederick March and Spencer Tracy, William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow fighting in a courtroom in Tennessee over whether or not a school teacher should be criminally punished for teaching Darwin in the public school. It turns out that the school teacher lost and was charged, but Mencken from the Baltimore Sun wrote about it and lampooned the religious conservatives so profoundly that it really was part of a collapse of that part of the movement. And Balmer says that what happened is that coincident at the time, somewhat influenced by this split, this cultural split took place in American Protestantism between what became known as the fundamentalists, or eventually the evangelicals, and the so-called mainline Protestants. And Balmer has a nice little description, if I can put my hand on it. I'm just going to try real quick to read this quick sentence here. He says, after the 1920s, fundamentalists, perceiving that American culture had turned against them, retreated from public life, but they did not disappear. Instead, they set about building a huge and intricate subculture of churches, Bible institutes, colleges, seminaries, Bible camps, mission societies, and publishing houses that provided the foundation for their resurgence in the 1970s. Now, the way I usually describe this is that this division, this loss, the so-called fundamentalists or the evangelical branch of American Protestantism, they were losing the battle against modernity. And as they did, they were losing many things. So what they did was they left, they withdrew. The way I describe it is that what became known as the mainline got the house and the kids and a divorce. They got the institutions, they got the church buildings, they got the people. And more evangelical Protestants had to go start again. Unfortunately, for mainline Protestants, they got old buildings and they got old people. And they had, you know, if you have an old house, it's so nice when you first get it. And then you realize it's an old house and it takes a lot of upkeep. And in many ways, over the last 100 years, mainline Protestantism has been in decline, in numeric decline, financial decline, influential decline. At the same time, this evangelical, this other branch, this other part of the movement has been in ascendancy. And Balmer says that 50 years after the Scopes monkey trial, the first born-again Christian, evangelical, fundamentalist Christian, entered the White House. You all remember who that was? It was Jimmy Carter, interestingly enough. But shortly thereafter, an alliance was formed between the so-called religious right, this evangelical movement, and large sections of the Republican Party. So I'm about to draw this a little bit to a close and just take a minute and say that that this set of divisions have political ramifications, they have institutional ramifications, they have economic ramifications, and that this very idea that you didn't have to get along, you could just schism you could go somewhere else. First, it's led to over 200 different denominations in American Protestantism. 200. 200. I think there are 30 types of Presbyterians. They're all over the place. And this set of splintering that was from the beginning definitional for Protestantism has led to the groundwork, I think, that has laid the foundation for deep divisions in our American culture that aren't just tied to these religious communities, but to the institutions that they have spawned and encouraged. So I want to stop, I think, here, and we can pick up this story a little more as we go on. But I want to lay that as a groundwork and start to engage you, and then make some suggestions. I will on what might be done about the splintering, about these differences and divisions. So I'm going to open to some questions. I got to turn my chat on. Has anyone been?
Sheldon, do you have a question?
Yes, within what you described as the mainline churches, they seem to make a distinction between Calvinism, those that are Calvinist,
Right.
versus something else. Can you help me understand what that means?
Yeah, sure. Well, there's like anything, there's a difference between Calvin and Calvinism, or Luther and Lutheranism. And Calvin himself was a French reformer, not a German reformer, but a French reformer, and established a society, a church-state alliance in Geneva in the 16th century. And but Calvinism, as it's often described, is also linked often with this Protestant work ethic. Calvin has a doctrine about salvation that, in Calvin's terms, tries to, I mean, I get too much in here, I'll be careful. In Calvin's terms, this doctrine has to do with the inability of human beings to save themselves. Let's use a different phrase for salvation: to be profoundly aware that you're loved. You can't make that yourself. Somebody has to love you. You can't make them love you. This was Calvin's deep insight. And so he developed a doctrine that had to do with whether or not you were saved, you were loved from the beginning, or it was by your action. And an ironic twist is that many Calvinists have interpreted, or the movement of Calvinism has interpreted, that the way you know you're saved is if you have been successful and worked hard and done lots of good and the like. And so there's a kind of a Protestant work ethic. You work hard to do it. And that's often associated with the term Calvinism. I actually think it's a misreading of Calvin myself, but you can see that that's there. The Calvinism, that principle, that set of principles about salvation and how you work on salvation, can be found both in the so-called mainline and in more evangelical, and even in even in African American theological traditions. I don't know if that's helpful. You want to follow up a little bit on it, Sheldon?
Sheldon, you need to unmute yourself.
Uh,
There you go.
I frequently, when I hear that discussion, and what you just said was very useful, they contrast that with Luther, with Martin Luther's teachings.
Right. So they're roughly contemporaries. Luther's just a little bit earlier than Calvin, but they're both 16th century Protestant reformers, and they both are dealing with this issue of how does one know who God is. Calvin has a wonderful description. I hate to go on and on about it, but I love this. He says, you can know God in the world. Look out at how beautiful the creation is. Look at the goodness you find in some human beings. And he says, it's all out there to see, but it's as if you had a fine thing in front of you and you didn't have any glasses. And he says, Scripture becomes the spectacles that allow you to interpret what you was already there and see. And this idea that Scripture plays such a pivotal role is in contradistinction, in opposition to the idea that you have to be taught this by someone else. You can actually have, if you can read, you can put on the glasses and you can start to see the movement and interpret God in the world. Luther also believed strongly in Scripture. The differences between Lutheran and Calvinism could fill volumes. They have, but essentially they're both working at the same thing, which is this idea about the ability to be to come close, to be shaped by the fundamental things about a relationship with God through the movement of God in the world, not so much by the movement of human agencies, but by God's action that we perceive and engage. So there are a whole lot of Lutherans, and today most of the Calvinists in America, so-called Calvinists, go by the label Presbyterians. Some of them also called Reformed, like the Reformed Church in America. I see Phil.
Rabbi Phil Miller has a question, and then Harvey, you have one after.
Thanks. Hi.
Hi.
I guess my question is, you mentioned this briefly, that one of the what you see one of the primary cause of the split between the mainline and the evangelical groups was, I guess we'd call it, creationism, or that that whether or not the Bible is giving us is the first word on history. But you mentioned also the issue of race, and is it the same impulse that led the evangelical church to its sort of pulling away from the main line? Was that same impulse that called pulling away over creation? Is that the same impulse that also pulls away because of race and sort of the direction that the country takes, and with the end of the Confederacy and slow, herky-jerky movement forward in terms of some notion of equality amongst the races?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question, and I wish that I had a great answer. I have some notions. One, for a long time in my own thinking, I affiliated, I believe, too closely the mainline's history of abolition, which is unfortunately a small subset of its history, with its ongoing history. And I believe that race has tainted every American religious movement, and I wouldn't say that creation itself is causal. I think the issue is larger. It's actually modernity. How does one live in what's the modern era? This not post-modernity. We're talking about this transition between 19th and 20th century. That in that transition, there's a rise in industrialization. There's a movement to urban centers. There's a increase in critical thinking, asking questions. So this Protestant principle that you could get access to things holy, to understand God by studying, by reading yourself, by not being taught by someone, but by being self-taught, was exploded with the increase. You know, if you I used to stand in line at the installation of new presidents at universities in Missouri. I was a president of a university or of a school, and I always used to, they line you up by the year that you were founded. So I'm going and you get all dressed up. And I always gave Mark Wrighton a hard time because he had to stand behind me, because WashU was founded in 1855 and we were founded in 1850 at Eden. So I got to be in front of him. But if you look at the mass number of schools, the majority of those schools were founded right around the time of the Civil War to the beginning of the 20th century. There's a huge explosion of intellectual activity in America. Ralph Waldo Emerson takes up the challenge to come up with an American intellectual life. Don't be dependent on Europe. Let's think for ourselves. Let's have our self-reliance and let's do this thing. So there's an explosion of critical thought, of intellectual activity, and each of those intellectual challenges starts to erode fundamental beliefs, things that we held and cherished dearly. And in many ways, American fundamentalism, to talk about the fundamentals, is a conservative movement trying to conserve, give me that old time religion instead of letting this assault go. Unfortunately, what was attached with that old time religion was also a series of practices that tolerated and encouraged slavery, that resisted more humane acts of reconstruction in the period of Reconstruction. But I want to be careful. I don't want to paint this all with evangelicals, because mainlines people going to their institutions, getting embracing modernity, did not immediately or often or consistently embrace anti-racism as well. And so the so-called original sin of America of racism has infected and affected all of us. So, is that helpful, Phil? You want to follow up?
You need to unmute. Unmute.
Yeah, there we go.
There we go.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dave. No, it is helpful. No, I certainly, I don't think I didn't write implying that, right, that there was vast anti-racism movements already throughout the mainline. But I guess what as you said, there was this part of mainline that was where the abolitionist movement did come out of from, and that's always sort of intrigued me very much. And maybe I too overreached in painting my picture of the mainline church overall.
Well, I want to claim a little bit of this, so too. I want to be careful given my corrective to my own thinking. But for me, I'm deeply grateful for my own church, and for instance, the United Church of Christ, which is an interesting ecumenical experiment. And that church has strong abolitionist roots. It had, there's an interesting thing they did. They had a missionary zeal as well, but in the mission field, they weren't just trying to eradicate religion. I was in Beirut, Lebanon a few years ago at American University, and they have a cornerstone at American University. And on the cornerstone, I'm not going to have it exactly right, but they list, you can come to this school, and then they list a variety of religious beliefs and practices and nationalities. They basically have an inclusive list, and they say you can come with these beliefs, and when you leave, you can leave with these beliefs. Our intent is not to take these beliefs away from you. But while you're with us, you'll know what we think and why. And I like this notion of having a perspective, sharing the perspective, but not sharing it in a proselytizing, dismissive, or destructive way, to value the culture and life of another while you share your own perspective. And That particular university was founded by Congregationalists, which is the predecessor to the United Church of Christ. And so I like this abolitionist thing. I like that that in the 1960s, many of these mainline churches were at the forefront of civil rights movement. Andy Young, you know Andy Young, who was a cohort of the former mayor of Atlanta. Andy Young grew up in Central Congregational Church. His father was a pastor in New Orleans and is an ordained minister in our church. We're glad to claim Andy Young and his strong work. And on. There's been these relationships, but including the role of women and the inclusion of gays and lesbians in society. So many of these mainline churches, their modernity, their embrace of intellectual life has also sometimes led them at the forefront of social change. Sometimes they've missed some things too. I'm looking at another. Go ahead. Yes.
There's a couple of chats, and then Harvey, I know you still have a question. Let me read the chats because it has to do, I think, with what you were just saying. Do you think the reason liberal mainline churches are losing members is because people are just no longer going to church at all? I belong to a Methodist church that is closing, but it used to be huge. Like you said, we could no longer afford to keep up our building. I know several other churches are also closing. Also, the Methodist Church itself may split over things like the LGBT issues.
So this question's probably occupied me more than anything else in the last 25 years. Why are churches in decline? Why is American religion not as vital as it used to be? What are the reasons? And there are many theories. I have a friend who's a scholar of this area, Bill McKinney, and he has what I call the McKinney theory, which is the reason these churches and synagogues and others are not doing so well in terms of numbers and influence is that they quit making babies at the right rate. They have negative birth rates. That is, if you have 2 people in a pew and they have 2 people in a pew and they have 2 people in a pew, but if your overall birth rate is below 2, it's not replacing, you have fewer and fewer. One thing about American Protestantism that's absolutely important, it's really about American religion, almost all American religion apart from Native American religion, is a history of immigration. So one of the interesting things that I think happened is that just about the same time that the numeric decline in these churches started to accelerate downward, it was also the same time that we had a change in our immigration policy. The 1965 Immigration Reform Act made a tremendous difference because what it did is it said, we used to take, if you had 10 Germans in America, you could have, and that was 10%, you had 10% Germans, your new immigrants could be 10%. If you had 10% Scottish, you could have 10%. The current position was the number that went. That reform, immigration reform, which I think was a wonderful reform act, actually, it opened the gates and it said, it made it really more about families, and families could come in and you'd come in numbers and different parts of the country. So immigration changed. But that meant that if you weren't having babies and you weren't getting new immigrants of your stripe, if you weren't getting Scotch Presbyterians from Scotland, and they didn't come sit next to you in the pew by immigrating, and you didn't have enough children to replace them, then you had a formula for numeric decline. There's another theory which says that political stances at these churches have driven people away. In this regard, I have a bibliographic note for you. It's a really extraordinary book by Robert Putnam and David Campbell. It's called American Grace. And they have again, not causation, but correlation. They have a theory that I really am persuaded by. And their theory is that for many generations, if you looked at American people, if they were religious, if they self-identified as religious, they were not likely to be any more one political party than another. Being religious and political, your political alliance was not affiliated. That is, the correlation between being a Democrat and a Republican correlated equally for being religious. Now, which religion? Some religions were more Democratic, some more Republican, but being religious itself didn't correlate with that. But increasingly, since the 1970s and on, the correlation between being religious and being Republican is quite high. It's much more likely. And that means that in the consciousness of America, religion and a political stance start to be correlated and aligned. And their argument, Putnam and Campbell, and it's more of a minor thesis, but I'm taken by it, is that young people are a little disgusted by it. They don't want to be associated with this relation. It's not that they're disgusted with republicanism, they're disgusted with politics and the alliance between politics and religion. And therefore they are rejecting religion. And I believe this is as true on the left as it is on the right. Oh, you can't say, well, we'll correct it. We'll show them that our church is all Democratic. We're very left-leaning. We're this way. I think that's as disgusting and as rejecting for young people as not. So that Campbell and Putnam argue that the increase, that each new generation in America today is more nuns, this category nuns, no longer affiliated, that correlation to being a nun, to not N-U-N, but not affiliated, non-religious, is affected by these alliances between politics and religion. Neither of them would argue that politics doesn't have a role in religion or religion in politics, but the narrow alignment between the two, they think is off-putting and erosive to the vitality of American religious life. I think there's some truth to that. It's a little hard to prove by my kids because one of them's an ordained minister, but I think you could prove it maybe by my second child. So I don't know what your own experience is.
Harvey?
Harvey, yeah.
David, if you attend a Protestant church service, as you know, before long, you're going to hear the concept of sin coming from the pulpit. And my question is, how does the emphasis on sin and the sinner vary among the various Protestant faiths?
So when you ask my grandson, Miles, how big is Miles? You go, how big? And he goes, this big. So Miles is big. The difference in the understanding of sin is like this. It's all over the place. And one pretty caricatured standard definition is sin is a cluster of particularly prescribable bad behaviors that one should not engage in. There are clear and simple rules. You follow the rules, you're not sinning. You don't follow the rules, you're sinning. You have to stop sinning and repent and become better. That's a behavioral, prescriptive definition of sin and operation of sin. And I think that's the standard caricature of sin for many people. For me, and it certainly is in my church, because we've had some lively discussion. I go to a very liberal church, as you might imagine, and my church doesn't like all this sin stuff. And I think sin is an extraordinarily rich category. not because of the description I just gave, but because it has to do with the separation, the fundamental inability inability to bridge a gap that I can't bridge. I can't accomplish what I need on my own. And every time I try to do it on my own, without being collaborative, without being dependent on other human beings or on God, I fall into an abyss. I do two things. I overcompensate or I hide. And so the prayer that I like is to ask for forgiveness for things that one has done and left undone. The things that I have done that are more destructive than anything is when I'm trying to make myself. And when I try to make myself and I don't think I can do it, then I go the other way. When I see somebody in need, their need is too great, I ignore them and I don't do anything at all. To me, that's a closer to a lively understanding of sin. The basic issue, though, Harvey, that's at stake, I think, in either way, is that it has to do with this notion of salvation as well. That is, there is a distance between the human creature and the vastness of God. And that distance is overcome less by our own action and more by the action of God. So to be saved, and that's got 1,000 different meanings as well, is in part to be loved by the lover, to be reached out to be embraced when you feel unlovable. And that notion, that's the sin and grace go together. This is this notion of grace, the undeserved love of the other is the thing about which gratitude is the most important element in church life. Certainly sin is not, it's a Christian notion. Well, it's not a Christian notion. Yeah, it animates all forms of Christianity. So someday, Harvey, we should have a long discussion about sin, because I think it really plays a role, and it does. Attitudes about sin are really influential here. So for instance, a phrase that's often used about gays and lesbians, we can love the sinner, but not the sin. That's to take homosexual behavior and make it sinful, and to reduce sin to a prescribed set of behaviors. That's not a position that I hold myself, but that's not an uncommon sort of position. So I'm watching my time. We got some more questions. I'm going to take a few more, and then I'm going to try to do some how do we get out of this mess?
We a couple of comments from Nancy Price, and I think they were previous to in part of your previous discussion. She mentioned Victorian age and Quakers and Germans were anti-slavery, weren't they?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, I was the president of Eden Seminary, which was founded in 1850. As I said, it was a group of Germans. So if you come into the United States at the cusp of the Civil War, what's your position going to be on slavery? And it turns out that this group doesn't have much of a position, both anti or pro. They're too busy trying to survive. And survival, in part, like any minority group, means keep your head low and don't get involved in a fight you can't manage. That's Germans. But there are also Germans who are Quakers and others. There are many different German immigration is over many, many generations. But certainly there are Quakers who are abolitionists and peace people. There are a variety of abolition groups, even Presbyterian, Lovejoy, Elijah Lovejoy, over here in Alton published a very strong abolitionist movement. You may not know this, but one of the reasons there was a flourishing of colleges in the Midwest, if you ever looked at Iowa and seen how many wonderful small liberal arts colleges there are, or in Minnesota, why did they get all these, even Ohio? I mean, they're just littered with first-rate small liberal arts colleges. One of the reasons they did that is that as the westward expansion took place, the idea was to get out there and start colleges and educate people so they would be anti-slavery, and therefore when they came into the country, they would not come in as slave states. I spoke at an anniversary at Grinnell College, and that was really the root of its founding, was to be an abolitionist school, standing in opposition to the, before Iowa would become a state, the people in Iowa would become abolitionists and anti-slavery. I have another one here. Yeah. So it's a question about Charlotte's late partner was raised Catholic and was amazed when she went to a UCC church and they didn't talk about sin and going to hell. So I want to take just a minute on this one because Sydney Mead has something to say about this as well, and I'm going to flip to an inside page. You see me reach for my glasses; they weren't up on the top of my head. So I only have readers, and I'm just I have a basket just full of glasses because I never know where they are, and they're all dime store readers. But when I go to read something, I have to have it. So, let's see if I can get my hand. Here it is. So Mead, Sydney Mead says that as the Protestant, and these were largely Protestant expansion took place in the United States, people would go west, they'd go west and they get to that place and there wasn't a church there. So this is one thing about Protestants is they affiliate, they pass on their education, their religious life through congregating. And there weren't congregations or institutions. They were out on the frontier. Mead quotes Professor Garrison. He says, with 90% of the population outside the church, the task of organized religion could not be limited to encouraging Christian nurture in Christian families or to ministering to old members. What they needed was not nurture or edification, but radical conversion. That is, you get out there in the frontier, and when you're out on the frontier, you've got to, if you don't get people churched, if you don't get them to get the religion, and soon, there's this great thing, will our children have faith? What will we do? Will our children have faith? No, will our faith have children? There won't be anybody left. So you've got to build a church quickly. And so there was a plan developed, a revival plan, often known as the Second Great Awakening. And Mead gives this wonderful quote, I love this, about Billy Sunday. He says, you are going to live forever in heaven, or you're going to live forever in hell. There's no other place, just the two. It's for you to decide. It's up to you, and you must decide now. That is, you've got to get it right now. So if you've got the church, nobody's going to church, go out and scare the hell out of them, or scare the hell out of them. Have them convert, have them make a decision, have them move. And that revivalist kind of reduction of religion to emotional response is a mark of much Protestantism. You can shape behavior by having eternal consequences to what you do. That is more prevalent, more common in so-called evangelical. It's not uncommon in African-American congregations as well. To the alternative, there are other ways of understanding how it is one decides, what is at stake, and how you involve. Billy Sunday's kind of out there on an extreme, but that is a characteristic, and it also is a driver for what is also known as Christian supersessionism. That is, only Christianity will get you, and you have to get rid of all other religion to do that. And I would say that's wrong. I think it's the foundation of what is harmed. It's at the root of a great deal of anti-Semitism. It's a dangerous and destructive theological position, and in my view, one that has to be countered over time. That you can embrace your own religion, you can celebrate it, you can even have it well formed, but to denigrate or to harm or to have a consequences of that religion lead to the destruction of the other is deadly dangerous. I'm gonna actually use that as my transition if I can, because this splintering, when there was lots of space, it was kind of cute. It led to a lot of regional diversity, good, interesting practices, food and culture, religion and culture go together. The accumulation of common people together, birds of a feather flock together, and if they didn't, they'd get up and nest somewhere else. It was kind of cute. But the impetus to divide, to spread, to not do the hard work of living together, I believe is something we have to combat. And I believe there are two things that are going on right now, right as we speak, that prove this point powerfully. COVID is not a respecter of nationalities or religions or regions or areas. People get sick and die. I hope it's not the case with you as it has been with me, but I have 4 people in my life who died this last year from COVID. That's not a lot, but that's 4 human beings that I've known, that have been friends, that I've spent time with. This is a tragic, horrible circumstance that is having a tremendous impact on us. And it's not just here, it's around the world. And if we don't have infinite space, we can't run and hide and go somewhere else. This alone is making us have to transcend these differences and find ways to live and work together. The second, no less urgent in my mind, in fact, profoundly more urgent, is climate change. I'm a firm believer in the reality of climate change. I'm terrified by its consequences. I have 3 and nearly a 4th grandchild. I want them to enjoy the beauty of the earth and the security of living in it, and their grandchildren as well. And yet, how we behave and what we do and how we treat the earth matters. And we can't do something here and not do it over there. We have to find ways to collaborate and to work together. And the idea that we could pick up and move somewhere else, it's simply not true. So for me, there's a lot at stake in overcoming these differences. And by that, I do not by any means mean or intend that I correct someone's theology and make them have my point of view. Rather, I think it's important that we learn to listen to one another, that we learn to disagree with one another, that we learn to argue with one another, but we also do what really works well in community. There's a philosopher, an American philosopher named Alistair McIntyre. And McIntyre talks about, he defines a community this way. I like this. A community is a socially embodied, enduring argument. When the argument stops, the community disappears. When you don't care enough to argue anymore, there's no community. Communities are socially embodied, enduring arguments. And vital, lively, global communities find ways to argue that are productive and useful. But I have a corollary to McIntyre, which is I think communities aren't socially embodied, enduring arguments. I think they're socially embodied, enduring arguments about the future. What will our world look like? How can we long endure? What are the things we can do to collaborate and to work together? And this is extremely important work. It's the most important work for us, to find ways to imagine a future that is not doomed, but a future where we are vibrant and live together, where we share the earth together, to imagine that, to care about it, to be animated by it, and to disagree about how we get there. Vehemently disagree, but not disagree that we need to get there. And that work, I think, is extremely important. And that work, it turns out that in the 20th century, there's a very interesting model for in Protestantism. In the 1920s and 1930s, the splitting that was going on, at the very time it was going on, there were a group of people who came to be known as the ecumenical movement, ECUMENICAL, ecumenical. And that was a movement that worked to not continue to splinter, but to find ways to come together. It's a movement that tried to do that so-called organically, that is to bring churches together that had divided. So my church, the United Church of Christ, had been 4 other churches, 4 Protestant churches that came together. The United Methodist Church, the United Presbyterian Church, the Lutheran Church in America, the ELCA, there were churches that were coming together, merging, overcoming these differences. It turns out that you spend a lot of time in merger and a lot of energy. And merger may not be the way to come together. For instance, we don't have to merge as countries to come together, but we can find ways to work together, to talk together, to engage each other in lively discussion. And I actually believe that one of the best models right here in St. Louis is a model that I've worked with Harvey on and worked with Lenny Frankel on and with many of you, and that is interfaith partnership. I saw Merrill here earlier, Dave Auden, Ann Miller, that interfaith conversation and work together, if we do it well, if we're push at it, can teach us lessons about how to disagree and to stand together. And those 2 things are what is most needed, in my view, not only in America, but in our world today. Not to stop disagreeing, but to learn to stand together for a future that's worthy of our grandchildren. Thank you all for your time and interest. I've gone over a little bit. I apologize for that. I just want to say thank you to Harvey for inviting me, and I was glad to be with you today.
Harvey, do you have any comments that you would like to close with? No? Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Greenhaw. We really appreciate your insights today. It was just a lot of information to process and wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today and giving us some great information. Thank
You're
you,
welcome.
everyone. Thank you, everyone. Bye. We'll see you later.